All right, so I need you to do something for me right now. I need you to close your eyes just for a second. All right, follow me here. I got this. Now you're at home, and it doesn't matter what year exactly. Pick any Friday night between 1990 and 1999 when you were, the right age to really understand what video games were. Somewhere that puts you in that good feels of like yesteryear. Young enough that your whole world could fit into maybe one living room. Now, your parents just gave you the green light to stay up late. And I'm not talking about a little bit late. I'm talking about late. Okay, I'm talking about MASH just came on. And right after MASH, the channel, it stopped broadcasting. If you guys could remember that far back. All right. Now, I want you to think about what's about to happen. Now, in your mind, I want you to go ahead and grab that remote controller, okay, in your brain. And I want you to feel that remote controller right now, like actually feel it in your hands. The specific weight, the specific texture, whether it was the Super Nintendo with those really nice, colorful buttons on it, the Sega Genesis remote, which, probably in the 90s before the PlayStation was one of the best controllers that you can just hold in your hands. Maybe it was the N64 remote. Now, I didn't have an N64 growing up, but I did play my friends. And maybe, just maybe, by this time, if we're talking about mid-90s, you had yourself a PlayStation DualShock. That remote was so balanced and so comfortable. It was the beginning of what set off a ton of other like-minded remotes. But I digress. Now, you feel that controller. You turn on that console and the screen lights up. And just like that, just in when you feel the warmth of that television, just the click, the static on the television that you used to pass your hands on and then shock your little brother. Okay. Once that happened, you were gone. You were no longer in your room. You were no longer in your house. There was no homework. It was all gone. Okay. You are now racing down Rainbow Road. Maybe you're somewhere else in Lara Croft's world, just disappearing. You were in a secret level in Super Mario Bros. All right. You were somewhere that existed entirely inside, if you were young enough, of a cartridge the size of a deck of cards or a disc the size of your hand. And it was a real thing. Okay. It was as real as anything you'd ever experience. Those Friday nights, those Saturday afternoons, that whole weekend, all right? Those just one more level moments that turn into 3 hours, maybe 4, 5, 6, 7 passing without you even noticing. That's what this episode is going to be about today. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to In Case I Missed It, 90s edition. Let's play.
90s, baby.
What's good, everybody? Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Alex, and we are on episode 3. And look, first, I want to say something about the day that you're hearing this, if you're listening to it on the day that it drops, okay? Because it's Saturday, we drop on Saturdays, and we drop on Saturdays on purpose, okay? Because this show for me is like a love letter to the 90s, and the 90s meant Saturday mornings were sacred. It was your time. It was the best time. It was the time nobody could take away from you. And dropping this show on a Saturday and Saturday mornings, right, just feels right. It feels like the only thing that made sense. So if you're just getting up and the show's downloaded on your phone or wherever, grab your cereal, get comfortable. Let's talk video games. All right. Now, quick thing on last week, we did Saturday morning cartoons, Fox Kids, Kids WB, ABC, CBS, The Rise, The Golden Era, and The Fall. The honest truth that, well, not everyone had cable, by the way, which meant broadcast television was the great equalizer for millions of kids across the country. That's all we had. We talked about Batman the Animated Series being drawn on black paper. We talked about Power Rangers getting rejected by every network before Fox even said yes. We talked about Margaret Loesch's building the greatest Saturday morning block in children's television history. Go back and listen after you listen to this episode because I'm truly proud of that one. I tried to get as much information as possible with the time constraints of not making it an 8-hour long documentary style podcast. But now today, I'm going to be real with you. Today's episode is one that I have been looking forward to since I started building this show about 1.5 years ago and putting all things together because gaming, that's what we're going to be talking about. Gaming in the 90s wasn't just something you did. It was a whole culture, a whole language, something every single kid had an option about regardless of where they came from, what they looked like, or how good they were at anything else. I mean, I, for instance, remember my older brother telling me, hey, video games are life. You live and die because of video games. I think it was because we were playing WWF WrestleMania Challenge. And I was just like, it's okay if you lose. And he's like, it's not okay. It was crazy. It was a different time. Now we're going to walk through the entire home gaming era of the 90s. And I mean the whole thing, start to finish, console by console, so you can feel the full arc of what happened during the decade and how incredible it actually was. We're going to talk a little about handhelds as well. All right. The console wars. We're talking the games that defined us. Nintendo Power, EGM magazine, GamePro, Blockbuster rentals, cheat codes, which were like currency back in the day. Mortal Kombat going to Congress, the day the N64 launched and the 350,000 units sold in just 3 days. And I do want to say up front that arcades were still a thing in the 90s. They were a very hot item. Arcades were awesome. But that deserves its own conversation. Okay, the quarter up culture, Street Fighter tournaments at the mall, the whole coin op golden age. We are coming back to that in a dedicated episode because it earns its own 90 minutes, right? Its own however long we're going to talk about it. Today, though, is about the home systems. The stuff that was in your living room, in your room, maybe your parents were the ones that had it in their room. The stuff that was yours at home. So, without further ado, let's get into it. All right, guys. So, if we're going to do this right, if we're really going to feel the full arc of 90s gaming and what it was, we have to start just a little bit before the decade. Because the 90s didn't invent home gaming. It inherited it. And understanding what it inherited makes the decade story so much richer because the Nintendo, we're going to start with that. The NES, right? Nintendo Entertainment System launched in America in 1985 and saved the video game industry. And I don't mean that dramatically. I mean it literally. The market had collapsed in 1983. The crash wiped out billions of dollars and killed consumer confidence in gaming entirely. And Nintendo walked out with the NES and that seal of quality with the likes of Super Mario Brothers, The Legend of Zelda, and rebuilt the whole thing from scratch. That was an actual gimmick. The seal of quality was on all of their boxes. Now, by the late 80s, the NES was a cultural institution. Mario was as recognizable as Mickey Mouse. Zelda had created an entire genre of adventure gaming. If you guys remember Contra, and everybody remembers that Konami code, up, down, up, down, left, right, BA. Almost messed that one up. That gave you 30 lives and was the most important secret a child could possess. Mega Man, Metroid, Duck Hunt, Tecmo Bowl, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, it's all there. The NES built an audience that was genuinely, deeply hungry for whatever came next. And right at the start of the 90s, Nintendo did give something. And it happened in April of 1989 in Japan, July 1989 in North America, before the decade actually officially started. Nintendo dropped the Game Boy. And we need to talk about the Game Boy because the Game Boy is one of the most important pieces of technology in the history of gaming. And it doesn't always get the credit it deserves. It was clunky, big, green screened. All right. Yes, this was a handheld gaming device. a portable system, something you could put in your pocket or in your backpack. You could throw it in the car door if you're going on long trips or next to your bed and play, actual Nintendo games anywhere you wanted. Not the Nintendo game, but, ports on a smallest bite-sized screen. The screen was, as I mentioned before, it was small, green. The graphics were not impressive, even by 1989 standards. And Sega's Game Gear, which came out in 1990, had a full-color backlit screen and was objectively way more powerful. And the Game Boy somehow still outsold everything because Nintendo launched it with a game, and that game was Tetris. Tetris was the most addictive puzzle game ever created in human history, packaged with a portable system that fit right in your hands. Honestly, I think it was over before it even started. The Game Boy became a fixture of childhood in a way that's hard to fully articulate if you don't experience it. My sister had one. I remember being so jealous that she had something like that she could take anywhere. Long car rides, waiting rooms, family dinners where you had it under the table and you thought no one could tell. Well, guess what? Everyone could tell that you had it. Maybe sleepovers. You had the little light that, you plug into it so you can see the screen. And you played, the hell out of it until the batteries went dead. Pokemon Red and Blue launched on Game Boy, by the way, in America here in September of 1998. And we probably should dedicate an entire separate episode just to that. And honestly, I think we might, because the cultural impact of those games and on the Game Boy platform was something that needs to be fully honored. Now, the Game Boy Pocket came out in 1996. I remember that one as well. Slimmer, lighter, better battery life. And the Game Boy Color in 1998. I was working at Toys R Us, and I remember doing Black Friday and giving everyone their little slips outside of the store. It finally gave the platform the color display it always deserved. The Game Boy line ran all the way through the decade and into the next one. And honestly, still to this day, and never once stopped being relevant, right? Sega launched the Game Gear in 1990 as their handheld competitor. It had the color screen, the backlit, it was backlit, technically superior to the Game Boy in almost absolutely every way, and it sold responsibly or reasonably well. It had a solid library. Sonic on the Go was really cool, but the battery situation was the only problem. I think the only problem with it. Had 6 AA batteries. Game Gear ate through 6 AA batteries in about 3 to 5 hours, and in the early 90s, that was basically your entire battery budget. The Game Boy, though, ran on 4 batteries for about 10 to 15 hours. Okay. That's crazy. All right. And when you're a kid and batteries are a finite resource, you kind of had to beg your parents all the time for. Battery life is the spec that mattered when it comes to these handhelds. But Game Boy won the handheld war. Okay. Game Gear deserved more love than it got. I remember my sister had a Game Boy. I had a Game Gear. Had Mortal Kombat on it, World Series Baseball, Sonic. God, I love that thing so much. So much. But enough about me. So 1990, 1991, this is where everything starts really happening. Because the Super Nintendo Entertainment System launches in North America. It launches in August of 1991, and it came out with Super Mario World bundled right in it. And Super Mario World was, and I want you to really hear me out on this, okay? At that time, one of the greatest launch games ever packaged with any console in the history of the medium. You're talking about Yoshi, Kate Mario, Star World, levels with multiple exits, a world that kept opening up the more you explored it. It just wasn't a great game. It was pretty much a statement. Nintendo was saying, hey, this is what we do. This is our standard. I want everyone else to keep up. The Super Nintendo library across its lifespan became a museum on its own, a masterpiece, right? With video games. They had A Link to the Past in 1992, Super Metroid in 1994, Chrono Trigger in 1995, which still today people think it's one of the most perfectly constructed RPGs ever made. You had Final Fantasy VI, Donkey Kong Country, which used pre-rendered 3D graphics that looked like nothing else in the market. Who can't remember Street Fighter 2 Turbo, F-Zero, Star Fox? I mean, hello. We're talking about games that even the ones that flopped, right, became the most beloved cult games in history. The Super Nintendo was Nintendo at their most confident and at its most creative. Every first party release felt like they were trying to outdo themselves. And honestly, I think they kept succeeding. But, right there alongside the Super NES, the whole time, right inching away was Sega. All right. And look, I need to give Sega their full flowers here because I don't think they always get them. It's hard to believe that. But let's talk about it. The Sega Genesis launched in North America in August of 1989 and has spent its first couple of years building momentum. And then in 1991, something happened where Sega did something that I still cannot fully believe a company at that time had the audacity to do. They launched a national advertising campaign for this children's product that directly called out Nintendo by name. I'm pretty sure you guys remember it. The tagline was Genesis does what Nintendon't. You guys remember that? Genesis does what Nintendon't. That was a corporation going on national television. I remember the commercials, the Game Gear commercials, the Sega commercials, and telling the children that their competitor is inferior. In 1991, it changed the way advertising was done. And it worked. It absolutely worked because they pretty much grabbed the attention of the older kids as well. And because they had a good brand. That brand was Sonic. Sonic the Hedgehog, which launched in June of 1991, a month before the Super NES even hit stores. Okay. And Sonic was a statement for Sega, a blue hedgehog who moved at insane speeds, had an attitude. If you guys remember, he tapped his foot impatiently if you left him standing too long. Like he was genuinely annoyed at you for not playing fast enough, okay? That was new. Mario was lovable, but Sonic was cool. And being cool mattered enormously when you were, 9 years old, and everything was about identity. The Genesis library fired back at Nintendo every single year at the Super NES. We're talking about Sonic 1, 2, 3, Sonic and Knuckles, a run of platformers that match Mario step for step and in some cases surpassed him for pure joy. You guys remember Streets of Rage 2, which might be the greatest beat 'em up ever made. I'll debate anyone on that. We had Fantasy Star, Shining Force, the EA Sports Empire, Madden, NBA Live, FIFA, all built their dominance on Genesis hardware. You guys remember the cartridges with the little yellow clip? Mortal Kombat with the blood code, when the Super Nintendo version had sweat instead of blood, gray sweat. They replaced the blood with gray sweat. And then wondered why the Genesis version completely blew them out of the water. You see, the console wars, right? Super Nintendo versus Genesis from 1991 through about maybe 1995 was the most important competition in the history of home gaming. Every Christmas was a battle. Every exclusive announcement was a whole moment. And every kid had a side. Every kid. Super Nintendo kids or Genesis kid. And that choice says something about who you were. Super Nintendo kids were, and I say this with full love, they were slightly more likely to have done their homework before sitting down to play. While Genesis kids, which was what I was, were slightly more likely to have a skateboard, be outside more often, getting in trouble. I don't know, it was weird. It's like, let's skip out on homework. Let's go do this instead, right? Now, neither was wrong, but both were completely accurate. Let's move along here. So let's jump out a little bit out of the 16-bit era, because in 1995, something happened that, it changed the whole battlefield. It shifted it. Because Sega launched the Saturn in May of 1995. It was $399. And I want to talk about the Saturn for a second, because the Saturn is one of the most fascinating and ultimately heartbreaking stories in gaming history. I didn't have one. My cousin did, and we played the hell out of it. Okay. I mean, you're talking about 1995. That's crazy. The Saturn was a genuinely powerful machine, especially for 2D games, fighting games, shoot 'em ups, 2D platformers. It was exceptional. The Japanese Saturn library is still talked about today by gaming historians. Nights into Dreams, Panzer Dragon Saga, Virtua Fighter 2, Guardian Heroes. Man, insane, genuinely great games. But the American launch was a disaster. That wasn't really the Saturn's fault, by the way. Sega of Japan decided to do a surprise launch at E3 in May of 1995. With no warnings for retailers, by the way. No warning for developers at all. No time for anyone to prepare a proper software library. And they already set the disaster right in front of everyone, right there and then. All right? Because then Sony walked out at the same press conference and announced that the PlayStation was coming in September, but for $299, $100 cheaper, right there in front of everybody. You can see the air going out of the room in real time. I remember watching this, reading about it. What a time. We lived in a time where we were insanely crazy about gaming. We hung on every word. We picked up EGM magazine. Maybe we went to Rite Aid or somewhere and just went into the magazine aisle at the bodega. And if you weren't looking at the magazines that were covered with black covers, if you know what I mean, we were going through EGM, Game Pro, Nintendo Power, and we were reading everything that was happening at E3. Just cinema, pure cinema back then for us. Let's get back to it. The Saturn never recovered, by the way, from that moment in America. Honestly, I think it deserved better. The games on that platform deserved a wider audience than they got. So, real quick, if you have it on you, pour one out for the Saturn. I have my coffee next to me, so I'll pour out some. No, I'm not. I'm going to pour out some coffee. But if I'll pour it. It was a great console that got caught in the wrong moment at the wrong time. Very, very. I played the hell out of NASCAR Destruction Derby on it, World Series Baseball. Man. Now, September 9th, 1995. That's when Sony enters the gaming market. And from that moment, nothing was ever the same. And I do want to let you guys know that Sony had a partnership with Super Nintendo that just completely backfired when Nintendo decided to go with someone else to try to create a disc system for them. And Sony was like, oh yeah, that's what you're going to do? You kind of just left us in the dark and didn't tell us you were going to go with someone else. And this is why these Sony PlayStation came to life. Okay. The PlayStation, as I just mentioned, used CDs instead of cartridges, which meant games could hold vastly more data. Full soundtracks. You used to be able to grab the PlayStation 1 games and put them in your CD player and listen to music. They had cinematic cutscenes, stories told with an ambition and scope that, man, cartridge-based games just couldn't match. Yes, the load times, I remember that. I'm with you. I know you're probably talking about that. I hear you. I lived through those load times too, okay? Sitting there watching a loading screen while your patience physically dissolved from your body. All of that was real. Okay? But we were born to wait. We were born to wait for greatness. All right? So let's not talk about, what loading screens were. Let's just be happy that we had them. Because not everybody just wants instant gratification. All right? And what was on the other side of that loading screen, as I mentioned just now, was worth every second of it. All right? Resident Evil in 1996. Let's talk about Resident Evil real quick. It invented survival horror as a genre and made the word zombie genuinely frightening again. Remember Lara Croft, Tomb Raider? That game changed what a gaming protagonist could look like. And I'm saying that because I know a lot of you out there were just pausing the game and certain screens and Trying to look at some polygonal women. Let's talk about Crash Bandicoot. Crash gave Sony their answer to Mario. It became their mascot. God, those commercials were great. You had Crash Bandicoot walking up to the Nintendo buildings. You remember that? Oh man, it's a Sega. Like it's just Sony themselves had an insane marketing campaign. Let's talk about Gran Turismo, the most realistic driving simulation anyone had ever played on a home console. Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which is still in the conversation again for one of the greatest action RPGs ever made at that time. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater in 1999, which didn't just make a great game, it introduced an entire generation to a soundtrack that genuinely changed how anyone understood music. Till this day, it still plays in my head. And finally, something that people still play today. I just saw somebody on Instagram playing and posting videos about it. Final Fantasy VII. I need everyone to stop for a second. Okay? If you're working out, just hear me out here. Because Final Fantasy VII is not just a game. It's a line. A before, okay, a line that was drawn. There was a before and there was an after. There is gaming before Final Fantasy VII, and then there's gaming after it. And they are not the same thing. The world of Midgar, Cloud Strife, the music, specifically like the music for Final Fantasy, was one of the most beautiful pieces of music composed for any medium in the entire 20th century. God, Final Fantasy VII was everywhere. They were front cover of every gaming magazine, PC gaming magazine. Like everyone was covering Final Fantasy. It had insane cutscenes. And there's a moment in that game, which I'm not going to name here. Okay. You know the one. There's people out there who haven't played it yet, and they deserve to experience it without me ruining it for them. But if you play it and you played it enough and you were a fan of it, you know what I'm talking about. Millions of players put their controller down and just sat there, feeling something they had never felt over a video game before. They felt actual grief for a character made of code. That's what Final Fantasy VII did. That's what the PlayStation made possible. The medium grew up with that game, and it never went back. Never. And obviously there was other games too for the PlayStation that made it memorable. And there was a lot of good ones, a lot of bad ones. Let's talk about something else here. September, big month, September 29th, 1996. Nintendo answers with what? You guessed it. The Nintendo 64. I have one right here. I have one on my gaming shrine back there. All right. And it launches with Super Mario 64. And Super Mario 64 was, look, if you were the right age when you first saw this game running, you remember exactly where you were. I'll just leave it at that. Right, Mario in actual 3 dimensions, a full 3D world where you can move through in every direction. You can control the camera, you can swim, fly, dive into paintings that were pretty much portals to other worlds. The sense of scale was unlike anything anyone had experienced before. Kids who saw it for the first time literally could not process what was happening, specifically if you grew up with the Nintendo era of Mario. It broke something in your brain in the absolute best way. Like your whole understanding of what could be just got expanded without your permission, right? Like Mario in 3D. Yes, the PlayStation did 3D games, but you're talking about your staple. Some people couldn't get into Sony PlayStation. They couldn't afford it. So they stayed with their Nintendo system or maybe their Super NES long enough until they were able to grab a Nintendo 64. All right. The N64 library, Super Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, GoldenEye 007, Mario Kart 64, Banjo-Kazooie, Star Fox 64, Donkey Kong 64. These games didn't just hold up. They set the grammar of modern gaming. And I loved how Nintendo always did that. They did that for Super Nintendo. It was, they added Super in front of everything. Super Baseball 93 or whatever, you know, and Nintendo 64 did it with their games. Everything had a 64 after it. If you guys remember. Ocarina of Time in 1998. Whew. And I will say this with complete conviction and defend it in any room. I think that was maybe one of the greatest video games ever made for Nintendo. Okay? It's been 25 years or more. And I between me playing a lot of these consoles and all these games, and it still holds up. The water temple is still causing people distress right now. Someone out there is stuck in the water temple as we speak. I feel for them, but it's worth it. GoldenEye 007 in 1997 invented the console first-person shooter and gave us 4-player split-screen multiplayer, which meant that Friday nights or anytime you had your friends over, it was on. 4 controllers, 1 TV, 4 screens. Someone always accusing someone else of screen watching. The arguments, the trash talk, the rematches, the specific physical, everyone in the same room energy that you just cannot replicate now online. You just can't. And then, right at the end of the decade, another big September launch. September 9th, 1999, Sega made one last swing. Oh man, the Sega Dreamcast. And I want to take a second here because the Dreamcast makes me genuinely emotional, and I'm not even slightly embarrassed about that. I remember working in Toys R Us and seeing the display for the first time and seeing it in action. It was great. The Dreamcast was ahead of its time in every measurable way. It was the first home console where they built in modem for online gaming. In 1999, before most people had broadband, before most people could fully imagine what online gaming was going to become, because people still had dial-up. Sega saw the future and built for it. The library was extraordinary. We're talking about Sonic Adventures, Crazy Taxi, Jet Set Radio, Shenmue, which cost $70 million to make, was the most expensive video game ever produced at the time, and was so detailed and so patient and so beautiful that it reads today as a direct ancestor of every open world game made since. You guys remember Soul Calibur, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, NFL 2K, NBA 2K? The Dreamcast should have won that generation by every creative measure. It deserved to win. It had its flaws. People could copy games. You didn't even need to own the game. You could go rent it, you can burn it, and then because it had no protections, that burned copy was playable. Lost the company a lot of money. But that was not only its direct fault, right? There was outside forces because the PlayStation 2 was coming. And just the announcement of the PlayStation 2 with its DVD playback and the full weight of Sony's marketing machine cast a shadow over the Dreamcast that it could not survive. All right. March 31st, 2001. I was in boot camp. Got a handwritten letter from my brother, because that's what we did. We wrote letters to each other. He was very young. He told me that, the Giants were going to the Super Bowl. He told me what happened at WrestleMania that year, all the matches. He wrote down exactly what happened. But he also told me that Sega discontinued the Dreamcast. Came in EGM. He was cutting clips off of it and sticking them inside the envelope and sending them to me at boot camp. All right. And that's when Sega exits the hardware business forever. That's one of the genuinely sad days in gaming history. A company that gave us Sonic, that gave us the Genesis, that made the Saturn and built the Dreamcast, gone from hardware. Just like that, man. Like till today, like we're talking about 25 years later, I'm still waiting. Come on, Sega. Some of us are still not over it. And I think we're allowed to be. Sega, you need to come out with at least a handheld. Come on now. But here's what I want to say about all of this, about every console. that we just walked through. None of it existed in isolation. It all existed inside a culture. And that culture had its own rituals, its own sacred texts, its own economy of knowledge that lived completely outside of anything adults controlled. Gaming knowledge was power in the 90s, like actual social playground power. If you knew the Konami code, to give friggin' yourself 30 extra lives in Contra, you were a resource. If you knew how to unlock Reptile in Mortal Kombat, through a specific, nearly impossible set of conditions on the bridge stage that I am not even going to try to explain right now because it would take the rest of the episode, you were a legend. Not the most popular kid necessarily, but I mean, you were still a legend in a completely different category from popular. Talking about cheat codes got traded on the school playground like it was currency. I'll tell you the stage select code for Sonic 2 if you tell me where the heart piece is in Zelda. Or, you show me the warp zone and I'll show you the secret exits here, there. The barter system was very real when it came to like cheat codes and how to get this, how to get that. And sometimes you can go online and print them out and then you were the only one who had a copy of it. So you were kind of just like going to the copy machine, making copies for your friends. It was crazy. It was crazy. It was one of the most generous things about being a kid in the 90s, right? Finding something extraordinary that immediately you wanted to share it with everyone else you knew, right? You couldn't email it. You couldn't just text it. Like you had to physically be in front of someone. That's the 90s gaming era. And there has genuinely never been anything else quite like it since. Truthfully. Now, here's the part of the show where I talk about the did you know facts. I'm going to give you 5 facts about 90s gaming that are going to reframe things you thought you already knew. And we'll start off with number 1, Mortal Kombat, the game with the spine ripping and the decapitation directly created the video game rating system. That little TM, whatever, that you see in the corners of every game sold in America. It's still being used today. So how did that come about? Well, Mortal Kombat hit arcades in 1992, and the fatalities were immediately a whole national conversation. When it came to home consoles in September 1993, Super Nintendo and Genesis at the same time. Nintendo removed the blood on the Super Nintendo, as I mentioned before, replaced it with that weird gray sweat. Sega kept the blood on the Genesis through a startup code. If you guys remember, ABACABB, the Genesis version outsold Super Nintendo version by leaps and bounds. By the way, lesson learned by everyone. Don't take stuff like that out. That's important. At the time, Senators Joe Lieberman and Herb Kohl convened actual congressional hearings in 1993, specifically about video game violence. Mortal Kombat was Exhibit A. Night Trap was Exhibit B. They threatened federal regulation if the industry didn't self-regulate. That's when the ESRB, the Entertainment Software Rating Board, was created back in 1994 as a direct result of this. Every rating label on every game box since that moment, E for everyone, T for teen, M for mature, exists because Mortal Kombat let you rip someone's spine out of their body and hold it up while the crowd behind you went wild. That is legacy. A legacy. An unintentional one, but a legacy. Let's talk about did you know number 2. The Game Boy launched in North America in July of 1989, as I mentioned before, and went to sell over 100 million units across its lifetime. But here's what most people don't know. Nintendo was so confident that the Game Boy would succeed that they bundled it with Tetris instead of a more visually impressive game. Because they knew that Tetris on a handheld was the most dangerous thing they could put in someone's hand. All right? The Soviet computer scientist who invented Tetris, and there's a whole movie about it, in 1984, did not receive any royalties from Nintendo's version until about 1996 when the licensing rights finally reverted to him. 12 years, the man who invented the game that helped sell 100 million Game Boys didn't see a damn royalty check from it for 12 years. And despite all of that, despite the small green screen, despite the bulky size, the fact that Sega's Game Gear was objectively more powerful and had a color backlit screen, the Game Boy won the handheld wars completely. Battery life, price, and Tetris, sometimes the simpler things, win. And it's usually because the simpler thing understood what people actually needed. Let's talk about, did you know, number 3, Nintendo Power. You guys remember that? Nintendo Power magazine had 1.5 million subscribers at its peak before the internet. Nintendo Power was the only source of walkthroughs, cheat codes, and game previews for millions of kids across America. When it arrived in your physical mailbox, it was a huge event. Oh God, the ink smell, the centerfold poster. I can smell the pages, the screenshots of games that weren't out yet that you study for weeks, like treasure maps. Kids wrote letters in with tips and secrets that hundreds of thousands of other kids would then use. I mean, I still collect magazines. I still have a subscription to Game Informer. Nintendo Power was the internet before the internet. The YouTube walkthrough, the Reddit thread, the Discord server, all of it traces back to a kid writing a letter to a magazine in 1993 saying, saying here's exactly how to get past the boss in level 7. They published it. The other kids read it. Those kids beat the game. A chain of generosity running through the U.S. postal system like an underground river. By the way, also EGM magazine, which I loved. Game Pro. EGM used to be able to create artwork on your envelopes, and when you submit a letter to them, they would look at the artwork and they would post the artwork on the magazine. Those are cool days, man. Did you know, number 4, Blockbuster Video was one of the most important gaming retailers in the entire decade. More important than GameStop, more important than Electronics Boutique. Yeah, Blockbuster and Funkoland and everything else in between. Renting a game before buying it was absolutely everything, because new games cost anywhere between $40 to $60, which was impossible to buy on allowance money. A rental for $3 or $4 over a weekend, extremely doable, except no memory card, right? If you were playing like a PlayStation game or Saturn. Most rentals came without one. No saves, which means you had 48 hours to get as far as you could in a game you couldn't save, right? With a Sunday night return deadline staring you down the entire time. Unless it's a cartridge game. Not a lot of cartridges back then had save points either. But yeah, unless you had a memory card at home, which a lot of people did, But you know what that all created? Some of the most skilled gamers of the decade, because the rental deadline forced a level of memorization and route optimization and pure determination that the modern save everywhere, checkpoint every 5 minutes gaming era has made completely unnecessary now. And finding the previous renters' save files already loaded sometimes in cartridges, Some cartridges, like I mentioned before, had like a little battery and a little save thing in it. You open the game and you're already in World 7. Some stranger you've never met did have to work for you. It's like a little ghost in a machine leaving you a gift. That was a whole 90s thing that, just doesn't exist anymore. And did you know, number 5? The Sega Dreamcast launched September 9th, 1999. That was a big date. I remember my math teacher making a big deal about it. The 9999999. Big deal. It was the first home gaming console with a built-in modem. As I mentioned before, online gaming capability back in 1999 was non-existent. And here's the part that makes this wild. The PlayStation 2, which launched in 2000 and effectively pretty much ended the Dreamcast commercial life, did not have a built-in, internet modem at launch. It actually had to be bought later on. It added that capability later through a separate internet adapter, which I also bought. I was on base. I had my first PlayStation 2 when I was in the Marine Corps. I remember going to the Marine Corps Exchange and buying it. So happy. Playing Madden against other people. The console that beat the Dreamcast. Crazy. It launched without a friggin' feature that the Dreamcast already had included as standard. So in other words, Sega had already built the infrastructure for the future of gaming. The online world that would eventually become the dominant mode of how people play today, and then got pushed out of the market before the future caught up to what they had already built. The Dreamcast was ahead of its time in the most literal and most heartbreaking way that, the phrase can be used. I need to get my hands on one. I got everything else except the Dreamcast. If you guys are hearing this and you know where I can get myself one, let me know. I know I can go to the GameStops and stuff like that, but they don't really have it. I need to go to like a retro store. Can't believe I'm saying that. Retro. Our gaming era is not retro. I don't care what anyone says. Let's get into our versus segment here, and I'm fully aware that this is the most dangerous segment of the most dangerous gaming episode I will ever probably record. Because we are ranking the 4 major 90s home gaming platforms, right? We're talking about PlayStation, Sega Genesis, Nintendo 64, and Super Nintendo. And before I say a single word, I need you to understand I love all 4 of these deeply and completely. This is not a takedown. This is family arguing about who mom loves most. Everybody knows they're loved. We're just gonna figure out in what order. Here's the criteria that you gotta meet, okay? The must play library, cultural impact, what the console contributed to gaming as a medium, and the feeling, the specific feeling of owning and playing it in the 90s, because feeling is why we are here. That's why this show exists, because we all miss that feeling. And we're gonna start off with number 4. And number 4 is the Super Nintendo. And before you decide to just shut down your podcast app and say, or close out the YouTube video and say, enough is enough, Alex, I don't want to listen to you, because I'm a big Super Nintendo fan. Hear me out. Because 4th on this list is still being better than almost every gaming platform ever made, right? We are splitting hairs between legends here. The Super Nintendo library is a flat-out museum. I mentioned this before. Super Mario World, A Link to the Past, Super Metroid, Chrono Trigger. It was just, it's a crazy lineup. Street Fighter 2 Turbo. These are games that defined entire genres, set standards the industry spent decades trying to match. So why 4th? Because the Super Nintendo, as extraordinary as it was, perfected what gaming had been building towards since the Nintendo, the original NES. It didn't reimagine what gaming could become. The console above it on this list, or should I say the consoles, did something that fundamentally changed the medium. The Super Nintendo made the existing language as good as it could possibly be, while the others invented entirely new ones. Perfecting, beats almost everything, all right? Except inventing. And yeah. So 4th, but with love, with enormous respect, the Super Nintendo is a perfect diamond, and we love a perfect diamond. Next up, 3rd, would be the Nintendo 64. The N64 library is smarter than you want it to be. That's just the truth. Nintendo stuck with cartridges when the rest of the industry went on to CDs, and that decision scared off third-party developers who needed the cheaper, higher capacity disc format. There were real stretches of the late 90s where the N64 release calendar was almost empty and you were playing Mario 64 for the 14th time, not because you chose to, but because that was what was available. Up until later, right? The wrestling games that came in for the N64 are legendary. WCW, NWO, WWE No Mercy, WrestleMania 2000. I think that stretch of games, but THQ back in the day, so good. But what the N64 first-party library accomplished, right? Super Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, GoldenEye, Banjo-Kazooie, Mario Kart, those games set the grammar for modern gaming, the vocabulary that every game designer still uses today. Super Mario 64 taught the industry how to build in 3 dimensions. Ocarina of Time invented mechanics still present in games released this year. GoldenEye gave us the blueprint for every console shooter and every split-screen Friday night that freaking followed. A platform whose contributions to the language of gaming are still being spoken 25 years later, belongs in the top 3 of any honest list. 3rd, but earned, and it earned every bit of it. Number 2 here. Can you take a guess? Did you guess right? Because it was the Sega Genesis. I know some of you are raising an eyebrow, and I want to make this case because it is a strong and it deserves to be made fully. The Genesis did something no other console on this list did in quite the same way. It changed the culture around gaming, right? The culture. Before the Genesis, gaming was broadly seen as a kid's hobby, something you were supposed to grow out of. The Genesis, through Sonic's attitude, through the aggressive marketing, you guys remember flipping through the magazines? They were edgy, okay? They had an edgier library through the blood codes in Mortal Kombat. Feeling like a small act of rebellion against Nintendo's clean world made gaming feel like something teenagers and young adults could own without embarrassment because you were called a nerd if you played video games. Okay, it grew the audience permanently. The kids who came to gaming through the Genesis became the PlayStation generation. I was one of them. They became the adult gaming market the entire industry built its future on. Without the Genesis pushing Nintendo, without the real competitive pressure, the Super Nintendo doesn't have to be as great as it was. Okay? The Genesis made Nintendo make the greatest first-party library in gaming history by refusing to lose. Plus, the library holds up all the way. Okay? We're talking Sonic 2 is one of the most purely joyful platformers of the decade. That they packaged that when they redid the Genesis. Remember when they made that smaller version of the Genesis? They put that game in there. It's incredible. Right? Streets of Rage 2, as I mentioned before, is one of the greatest beat 'em ups ever made. I think we go back to it now. All the companies are now like making retro style Streets of Rage style video games. The EA Sports Empire was born on the Genesis hardware. Okay? And the full Sega arc matters here. Genesis into Saturn, Saturn into Dreamcast. It's one of the great creative underdog stories in the history of the medium. Second place honors all of it. The fighting spirit, the innovation, the heartbreak of the freaking Dreamcast. Sega deserved to go out second. And honestly, that's my tribute to them. And first, the PlayStation. PlayStation is the greatest home gaming platform of the 90s. And it's not a particularly close call either. What Sony did when they entered this market in 1995 is change what games were allowed to be. Not just the graphics, not just the technology, what games could make you feel. What stories they were allowed to tell. What they were allowed to do to the person holding the controller. Final Fantasy VII made millions of people cry over characters. Okay? Metal Gear Solid was being studied in film schools alongside actual films. Resident Evil invented a genre, its own genre. Gran Turismo redefined simulation. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. I mean, we can go on and on here. When Madden came in, all the baseball games and sports games and NBA games, NBA Showdown, like just transcended, man. And the DualShock controller that was introduced in 1997 was the first truly great controller. Holding it for the first time, you understood immediately in your hands before you even turned the console on what a controller was supposed to feel like. Everything after was measured against it, by the way. Just chef's kiss. PlayStation won the generation by making every right decision. We're talking about hardware, pricing, developer relationships, library building, and produce something that the other platforms couldn't match in scope or in ambition. First place earned completely. And the greatest thing I can say about it is that the PlayStation set the standard that every console for the next 25 plus years since has been measured against. That's a first place finish that means something long after the 90s decade was over. All right, hot take time. And this one I genuinely believe, and I'm going to say it without softening at all, by the way. These hot takes, I'm going to own them. Video games in the 90s, right? They were the greatest educational tool of the decade. Not in spite of the fun, but because of the fun. I know how that sounds. The senators who dragged Mortal Kombat into a congressional hearing were not sitting there thinking, what a fantastic learning environment. The parents who put screen time limits in place, some of that was legitimate concern, some of was moral panic. The ratio depended on who you were talking to. But here's what was actually happening inside those games. Persistence. Because every 90s game was hard, man. Not fake hard. I mean, meaningfully hard. The kind of hard that required you to figure out, what were you doing wrong, and truly something different, man. Mega Man, Contra, Battletoads, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was so difficult. It became a cultural shorthand for impossible, okay? Super Metroid, which gave you no map markers, no quest indicators, no tutorial pop-ups. Just a world and the expectation that, well, you're going to have to figure it out. These games train kids in the discipline of repeated failure, in analyzing what went wrong and adjusting it. Okay? In understanding pretty much that success at anything genuinely hard comes from doing it badly, understanding why, and doing it less badly the next time. That is one of the most important lessons a human being can learn, and gaming was teaching it to 9-year-olds who thought they were just trying to get past Bowser. Problem solving. Let's talk about problem solving. Every Zelda puzzle is a problem solving exercise wrapped in mythology and adventure. Okay. The item economy in Metroid, figuring out which upgrade unlocks which area, which abilities required for which progression. That's systems thinking. That's logic. That's the kind of analytical reasoning MBA programs charge tens of thousands of dollars to teach. Let's talk about reading. Every RPG, every Final Fantasy, every Chrono Trigger required you to read thousands of words, dialogue, world building, okay, character development, plot. Kids who played Final Fantasy VII read more words in that game than in most novels assigned to them in that school year. And they read them eagerly, okay, because they needed to know what happened next in a way that no assigned reading could ever manufacture. And here's the truth about learning that doesn't get said enough. The most effective learning doesn't feel like learning. It feels like a story you can't stop watching, right? A world you can't stop exploring. When you actually care about what happens, when you're invested in the character and the outcome, you retain things that no classroom could ever give you. And that's why I'm a storyteller today. And I love writing films. I love writing rundowns and talking about things just like I am right now. It built who I am today. Okay. The kid who stayed up too late because they were so close to the next save point in A Link to the Past was not wasting their time. They were developing pattern recognition, spatial reasoning, and persistence to fail 17 times and try an 18th. We were learning the whole time, every single one of us. We just had way too much fun to know it. Hey, do me a favor, if this episode gave you anything, if it put you back on that couch even for 30 seconds, go drop me five stars. Rate me. Please do so. 30 seconds, 5 stars. It changes how the platform sees this show and how people find it. Okay? And share this episode with the person whose controller you used to fight over. You know exactly who I'm talking about. Send it to them right now. No explanation needed. They'll know why once they press play. Now, next week, we're doing something we're going to do every 4th episode for the entire season, right? So we're heading into episode 4. We're stepping all the way back and looking at one full year in the decade through a full 360-degree lens. Next week is our first year recap, and we're starting at the very beginning, 1990, the year the decade was born. Nelson Mandela walking out of prison after 27 years. Home Alone become the highest grossing film of the year. Milli Vanilli getting their Grammy taken back. Mariah Carey arriving with 4 #1 singles from a debut album. The World Wide Web quietly being proposed in a Swiss laboratory by a man who had no idea what he was about to do to humanity. That episode is the foundation of everything that follows. So come back next Saturday morning. We'll be here, or listen at your own leisure. I'm Alex, and as always, in case I missed it, the 90s were better.